This screencast shall demonstrate how a XSD schema change can influence the EEF model editor, and the example that shall be taken into consideration is the references that go out from a requirement. These references can be refinements, realizations, copies, and links. And we see here the outline of the Primel subset XSD file that has been derived from the original Primel vocabulary. And we have a look at the requirement element, and we see that a requirement has a requirement type, which is derived from Primel element base type, and the element that is interesting in this particular screencast is the references element, and this element is of the type references underscore requirement, and here is only a documentation, but the type references underscore requirement is of course contained in our Primel subset XSD as well, and we have it here, and the structure of this type can be expanded here, and we see the different sorts of references that were just mentioned, like realize, refine, copy, and link to. And the important thing is for this structure that we have under the requirement, remember that we have this references element, and under this references element we have a realize element, and under a realize element is a modification request element. So we have 3 levels of nesting of elements here, and this causes EEF to reflect this nesting in the tree view and in the forms. So what we want to achieve is an integration of these references, not 2 levels down from a requirement, but on the requirement form itself. So for this idea we have created a Primel subset underscore ref XSD, which is basically the same structure, only that it changes some constructs in this references area. So we have the requirement element again, and among the unchanged elements like state machine, use case diagram, and so forth, we have substituted the references element by a choice, an XSD choice group, and this choice has a modification request as a potential sub-element, a requirement, external document, external requirement, open point, and feature. So the element level that has been 1 level further down the hierarchy has now got 2 levels up. So we have the requirement, and directly under the requirement we have, for example, a modification request element. This is of the modification request type, and what is new in this sort of structure is the ref type, which is an attribute, and in this case it's fixed to realize, because modification request, when part of a reference from a requirement, is always a realization. A case where this ref type attribute is not fixed but can have many different values is for a requirement. A requirement can be either a refinement, a copy, or a link to reference outgoing from another requirement. So we sort of changed the structure in order to have a less nested structure, and this causes EEF to integrate the structure in the form on the requirement. So in case we have this XSD file as the basis for an EMF and EEF generation, this has already been applied here. So let's move to the prime subset ref components, which is the components of EEF reflected in this model. And we see the requirement type 1, which is in our case the type that reflects a requirement, has the already known elements history, description, information, ID, and so forth. And now we also have the modification request, requirement, external document, and so forth. These are the elements that we added on this level, since we changed the structure in the way just described. So this structure would be reflected in one big form in EEF, and we see here this container level. This is a layer that EEF applies, and it substructures a form. So we might put these from modification request to feature in yet another container, and we can add such a container by right-clicking, adding a new child of type container. Double-clicking opens a dialog which lets us enter a name for it, which in this case might be references. The representation that this container takes is a widget group. We confirm this and confirm this dialog. And now we might drag and drop these elements, first marking them and then dragging them into this just created container. So we see the tree view reflects it. We have the properties, which now only contains history and so forth. And we have our just created container called references with modification request, requirement, and the others. And if we save this and invoke the generation step again from EEF, we can see in a moment what our schema change and our container creation is causing in the EEF plugin we are just generating. So these container creations are not limited to such a use case demonstrated here, but can in other cases cause a better substructuring of EEF forms, applicable in many cases as well. So this is just one use case of such a container. So now that our generation has finished, we might run our editor plugin in the workbench and check our example file, how it is displayed and how it reflects our schema changes just introduced into the EEF editor. So the change we applied is only one possible change. It does not reflect all constraints from the original Prime constructs and structures, but it comes quite close. So for this use case, it might suffice, and let's see how this looks. Let's create a requirement under this requirement group, and we see here our properties container that existed before with history, description, information, and the other elements. And if we scroll down, we have this references container with our modification request, requirement, external document, and so forth. These are by default, as they are multi-valued containment references, are reflected with this advanced table composition that we've already seen. And to add, for example, a requirement reference, we might click onto this plus button, and we get the dialog for this reference outgoing from a requirement to a requirement. And we might select the type of reference which might be refine. The ref ID is directly taken from the original Primel constructs and would reference our requirement, and the version might be added here and filled in with the appropriate information. So what we see is we have new advanced table compositions on our requirement form, and we have to substructure it a little more appropriate. We have this properties container that we had before. We might collapse this and collapse this. So we see next to each other properties and references, and we can expand the one that is in question in the use case we have. So we might add these references, and this is a good demonstration case of how an XSD schema change is reflected in the EMF and EEF models, and how this, as the last consequence, is reflected in the EEF forms view.